You know what's wild? Every year, this country tells the same story: pilgrims, peace, and pie, like it was some sort of miracle of unity. But that's not what happened. Thanksgiving wasn't a feel-good dinner. It was a turning point, the moment that kindness got repaid with blood. Let's start there. The pilgrims didn't land on empty land. They landed on land where people had already lived. They'd already built and farmed for thousands of years. And most of those people, the Wampanoag, had just survived a pandemic that the Europeans brought. You dirty heathens. It wiped out entire villages before the Mayflower even showed up. So when those starving settlers landed in 1620, they weren't saved by luck. They were saved by mercy. The Wampanoag taught them how to live off of land that wasn't theirs, how to grow food, how to fish, how to stay alive. And that's the part they love to tell, but only half of it, of course. The first Thanksgiving wasn't even called that. It wasn't a holiday, it was a tense peace meeting. Two nations sitting down, both knowing that it could go bad at any moment. And for a while, it held, until the settlers wanted more. Greedy bastards. More land, more control. Then came the broken treaties, the stolen crops, the forced conversions. By 1637, English colonists had killed over 700 Pequot men, women, and children, burnt them alive, and then held their first day of official Thanksgiving to celebrate the massacre. That's the part the textbooks leave out. That's what they dressed up in paper hats and called gratitude. The Thanksgiving that we know now, that didn't come until 200 years later, during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln needed something to pull the country together, so he made Thanksgiving a national holiday in 1863. He wasn't honoring peace, he was manufacturing nostalgia, a story to distract a broken nation from how violent it had always been. And over time, that story became comfort, because it's easier to celebrate a myth than face a massacre. It's easier to say we were all friends than admit what this country did to survive. That's how America rewrites pain, with parades and prayers. For Native people, Thanksgiving is not a celebration. It's mourning. It's about loss, survival, and the refusal to disappear. Every year, Indigenous families gather, not to give thanks, but to remember. Because the truth didn't vanish with the tribes that they tried to erase. It's still here. They are still here. So yeah, eat with your people, love on them. Be grateful, make sure to do land acknowledgments. But don't pretend that this day was born out of peace. It was born out of blood. And a lie so big they built an entire holiday to cover it. The real story of Thanksgiving isn't what they told you. It's what they didn't want you to know.
Everything you know about Thanksgiving is a lie, because Thanksgiving Day is a celebration of Native American genocide. And I'm sorry to burst your bubble, because we all grew up with the idea that Thanksgiving Day was a day where we gave thanks and we sit around with our family, have turkey stuffing, a little bit of pumpkin pie. We remember the Pilgrims and the Indians and how they first broke bread together. And if we look back to the autumn of 1621, when the natives were celebrating the autumn harvest and happened to share with the Pilgrims and ill-equipped for survival on our land, many like to consider that the first Thanksgiving. However, there was no celebrating together. This was the natives saving the Pilgrims' ass. You're welcome. And how did they return the favor? With murder, of course. Because the actual first Thanksgiving was in 1637. That's because this is when Colony Bay Governor John Winthrop declared it a day of Thanksgiving. And that's because he had just finished ordering the massacre of hundreds of Pequot men, women, and children. They were all slaughtered in what is now known as Mystic, Connecticut. And that's when he declared that it was a day of Thanksgiving, because he had erratic. And so he declared it a day of Thanksgiving. And it wasn't until good old Honest Abe, the one that took land from natives to give to settlers and further his railroad, and the one responsible for the largest mass execution in United States history of 38 Dakota tribal members. Yeah, he's the one that declared the first official Thanksgiving. And I'm not telling you can't sit down and have your turkey, your stuffing, and your pie. Go spend some time with your family, but recognize and acknowledge the Native American contribution and loss. While you're discussing what you're thankful for, maybe consider the fact that you're on stolen land. You're on native land. While we don't want you to leave your house, you can at least do a land acknowledgement. Use sources like native.ca or Whose Land website and app to see exactly what native lands you're on. Remember, the United States is actively breaking over 500 treaties, illegally occupying land that rightfully and legally belongs to Native people. Look into Native causes where you can donate, who you can support. Check out Native American activists, creators, actors, authors, chefs, take some time to learn about Native American history, heritage, and culture. Because Native American people not only are still under genocide, our women are still in an MMIW crisis, many natives live in food deserts, don't have access to clean water, we have the highest rates of unaliving, the lowest rates of pay, unequal access to education, health services, and mental health services. Because of the history and what Native people are going through today, it is a day of mourning. So while you sit down with your family, just remember that natives are still here and recognize and remember the true meaning and history of this holiday.
The Pilgrims never invited Native Americans to the first Thanksgiving. In fact, most of what you were taught about...
All right, now, welcome back. Now, in today's one, many people, of course, grew up knowing about, the story of Thanksgiving and that the Pilgrims and the Native Americans sat together peacefully, shared food, and celebrated friendship. But when we look at the real history, things were not that perfect. Now, when the Pilgrims arrived in the 1600s, Native American communities had already lived on that land for thousands of years. And at first, there was, some cooperation, especially with the, Wampanoag group of people who helped the newcomers, survive. But soon after, the relationship, drastically deteriorated and changed. So as more Europeans came in, as they were coming in, they began taking native land, spreading diseases, and forcing people out of their homes. And whole communities were wiped out instead of peaceful coexistence with the indigenous people and the oncoming or the incoming, the influx of the Europeans coexistence. The period that followed was marked by violence, displacement, and loss of Native Americans. So it's about this one that while the Thanksgiving holiday today focuses on gratitude, family, and sharing meals, its roots came from a time when Native people, suffered greatly. Many Native American groups actually used the day to remember the pain, calling it a national day of mourning instead of, celebrating. It's about this one that we have got these nice people here, courtesy of them, the creators, who have come out, debunking that particular myth. And me and you are going to listen and we're going to make our thoughts and judgment over the same, because there are misconception stories that are conflicting out there. So, not yet to the opinion poll. Let's keep on watching, and then of course we show up at the end of this particular show with our thoughts and comments over the same.
Thanksgiving in school, it's a myth that was invented during the Civil War when the United States needed a great morality tale about its origins. But this is what really happened. October 1621, not November, October. The colonists at Plymouth held a 3-day harvest celebration. They didn't call it Thanksgiving. The Puritans actually fasted on real Thanksgiving. We're celebrating that 51 of them had made it through to the harvest. And the part of the story that you were told about them being helped by the local Wampanoag, that part is true. Just before the Pilgrims had shown up, the Wampanoag had suffered through a horrible pandemic caused by the white man's diseases that had killed 9 out of every 10 of them. So they took sympathy on the poor, starving colonists and taught them how to survive. Colonists, as part of the harvest celebration, started shooting their guns up in the air. And the Wampanoag, hearing that, thought that they were under attack. So 90 of their warriors went rushing to help defend the colonists. And that's when they discovered that the Pilgrims were having a party that they had not been invited to. But they decided to stay anyway. And it was kind of a BYOB party. The Wampanoag brought with them, according to the colonist records, 5 different deer, waterfowl like ducks and geese, shellfish like clams, mussels, and eels, a corn dish that was like a thick porridge, some pumpkin, and some gourd dishes, some nuts and berries. No turkey. You might think that the colonists were kind of mad that these guys had crashed their party, but there wasn't a lot they could do about them. There were only 53 colonists alive, and the Wampanoag outnumbered them about 2 to 1. So yes, the Thanksgiving dinner was a real event, but it wasn't what it was described to you when you were in school. That was a much later American invention. And sadly, the friendship of that first Thanksgiving dinner would not continue. More and more English would arrive. They would establish courts that for some reason always seemed to find in favor of the English colonists against the Wampanoag. Livestock would be introduced that would force the Wampanoag off of their land. And in 1675, the 2 previous friends would go to war against each other in what was known as the King Philip's War. And it would be one of the most deadly wars in all of the Americas per capita. The time they were done, the colonists would have burnt to the ground the Wampanoags villages. They would have killed thousands of them, and they would have taken thousands more, made them slaves, and sent them off to the Caribbean. And they cut off the head of the great warrior chief Metacom, and for 20 years, the Pilgrims displayed it in their town. History is always more complicated and more interesting than the myth that we have been taught.
I'm going to dispel 10 commonly held myths regarding Thanksgiving. Myth 1. The Pilgrims came to the Americas for religious freedom. The separatists, called Pilgrims today, were actually living in Holland where they had religious freedom, and they left for the Americas to maintain their English identity and make money. Myth 2. The Americas were loosely populated before European arrival. But many historians claim at least 100 million people lived in the Americas before 1492. Myth 3. The arrival of the Mayflower was the first contact between indigenous peoples and the English. For over a century before Pilgrims arrived, Europeans traded and raided the Atlantic coast to enslave indigenous people. Tesquantum, more commonly known as Squanto, spoke English before the Pilgrims settled, as he had already been enslaved in Europe. The English struggled to settle as the coast was already heavily populated. However, their diseases decimated indigenous populations, which led to a political crisis. Myth 4. Thanksgiving was a friendly alliance. After the Pilgrims settled, the Wampanoag forged a military alliance with the Pilgrims to fend off rivals because their nation was weakened by disease. Myth 5. Pilgrims were tolerant. Pilgrims were theocratic colonizers who brutally suppressed religious and political dissent. Their city upon a hill passed discriminatory laws to ban dissenters and even issued the death penalty. Myth 6. Pilgrims were rugged pioneers cultivating the land. The Pilgrims would have probably continued to die off had they not been shown how to properly grow crops by the indigenous peoples who have been cultivating the land for millennia. Myth 7. The Pilgrims lived in peace with other indigenous nations. The English colonizers felt they had a right to other people's land. In 1637, the English slaughtered at least 500 Pequot men, women, and children and burned down their village to seize land. A Thanksgiving feast was held to celebrate. The original Thanksgiving alliance deteriorated and culminated in King Philip's War. Metacomet, known as King Philip to the English, attempted to stop European expansion. This conflict decimated the indigenous population. Many survivors were sold into slavery abroad, and women and children were enslaved by English colonists. Myth 8. Thanksgiving was always a holiday. In 1863, Lincoln proclaimed Thanksgiving a national holiday to unite a fractured country during the Civil War. Myth 9. Everyone celebrates Thanksgiving. Some prefer a national day of mourning to acknowledge genocide and displacement and celebrate centuries of indigenous resistance. Myth 10. The Wampanoag are no longer here. Stories are told as if the indigenous nations involved are just non-existent today. This erasure is intentional, but thousands of Wampanoags, like many indigenous nations, have survived for centuries and are still here. It's a grave injustice to those in the past and those today to mythologize holidays for political purposes or comfort. Did you know this history?
Did you know the Wampanoag people of Massachusetts, where the Pilgrims first landed, weren't even invited to the first Thanksgiving dinner? That's a myth. I kid you not. They probably wouldn't even have realized it was happening if not for the bursts of celebratory cannon fire from the Pilgrims. There was also a little thing called death, before and after, and to this day, quite a tragic amount of it. Bear with me, there is no problem with taking advantage of a federal holiday to organize time with your loved ones. What? You want to hang out with your brother who you haven't seen in months because he lives across the country and works 200 hours a week, except for this time of year? You wretch! Now, this holiday means different things for different people, and countless cultures across the continent held harvest celebrations long before the first Pilgrims set a single tacky big-buckled clown shoe upon the soil. But let's not beat around the bush and pretend British people gave a single solitary crap about the Wampanoags or any stranger with an unfamiliar skin color. Let's instead be aware that National Day of Mourning was established in the 1970s after Wamsutta Frank James, a Wampanoag tribe leader, was forbidden from speaking at the Massachusetts Thanksgiving celebration because apparently his speech involving historical events that involved his own people was too inflammatory for the public's precious, delicate eardrums. The Day of Mourning takes place every year and is a time of public education on Indigenous history, cultures, and issues to protest and dispel the myths surrounding Thanksgiving that many of us, myself included, learned during childhood. Let's be aware of that. And let's take care to actively support the people who were here long before we were and who are still here today, maneuvering through a society that still sells their regalia as Halloween costumes. In a country currently represented by some freakish uggo who decided DEI initiatives are useless, thereby resulting in the Justice Department removing the report on Indigenous deaths and disappearances from its website in February of this year. In a country full of people who pushed forward with building alligator Alcatraz on sacred Floridian land, and who are still trying to push forward with building a new ICE facility right here in Washington state, on tribal land, because it would technically enable the devious circumvention of rules meant to protect human life. Now, if you are not attending any much-needed or necessary wholesome events or mandatory dinners with the in-laws, consider spending your Thanksgiving evening reading something kind of cool, such as a blog called American Indians in Children's Literature, run by Dr. Debbie Reese, or donate to organizations such as the Navajo Water Project or the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. Prioritize learning from the Mashpee Wampanoag in Massachusetts. Learn from their perspectives and accounts, not from a middle-grade, white-centric school book from 2002. My God, you are better than that. If you are going to a family gathering of any kind, the least you can do is argue back when crusty Uncle Eugene spews his bigoted foolishness, because nobody should get to spread lies without pushback. I'm not here to bring you down or give you chores that you have to do. It'd be cool if you did, though.
Thanksgiving originally celebrated the 1637 massacre of the Pequot tribe. English and Dutch pilgrims surrounded and shot the Pequot natives. Women and children who huddled inside the longhouse were burnt alive. The rotting flesh could be smelled a mile away. John Winthrop, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, declared a day of Thanksgiving after the slaughter. The remaining women and children were sold into slavery, while the rest were murdered. Following a successful raid against the Pequot, the churches announced a second day of Thanksgiving to celebrate victory over the Indian savages. Next Thanksgiving, when you gather with your loved ones to thank God for all your blessings, think about the thousands of natives that were murdered on these national holidays. Truth is.
All right, now, welcome back again. I told you that at the very onset of our show that I'll show at the end of this particular video with more thoughts and comments over the same. And here we go. Hope that you've also done the same. If really touched you, then you should have just done the same. Like the conversation should, let it continue in the comment section. Now, that also brings into another topic, that the truth was cooked. And we are saying that the indigenous people are not, the white individuals who claim to taking back the land to its former glory. The Native Americans, the Red Indians, now and again, from the Thanksgiving celebration eve that we are, experiencing and we are in, it's a reminder that, you see, a commemoration of the life lost. It's like a mourning, and it's not supposed to be a celebration that, as the books had already spread, or as it been taught rather, and that also brings us to a newer light, a light that its history has always been cooked. And that is the reasons why we have got all these particular conflicting theories and conflicting information out there, simply because some people, they want to spread some narratives that favors them in one or the other, and that the others should see themselves as either aliens, the immigrants, or from outside. I go by Sherlock. If you bumped across this one accidentally, how about a thumbs up? That will put a very big smile on my face. And a comment, tiny little comment on the comment section of your thoughts about this particular video. See you in the next time.